very exciting morning and an exciting presentation. My name is Adam Bello. I'm the Irondequoit Town Supervisor, and it's my privilege today to welcome some real distinguished leaders that we have in our community to address us today about something that's very important, not just for the state of New York, but also for right here in Irondequoit in Monroe County, and that's the state budget. Before we get started, there are a number of public officials in the room who I do want to recognize. In the back is Brighton Town Supervisor Bill Maley. I saw County Legislator Joe Morelli is with us this morning. Irondequoit Town Council Member Irina Skrobach is here. And I also saw Councilman Dave Seeley from Irondequoit is here as well. And before we hear from the distinguished majority leader, I do want to call forward to say a few remarks. One of my partners in government who is just doing great things in the town of Brighton, and really somebody we could work together with and partner with to make sure that we're doing the best work we could do for our community, sharing resources, sharing services and ideas to make sure that we're constantly doing more with less and really doing a great job serving our residents, and that's Town Supervisor Bill Maley.
Thank you, Adam. I had the pleasure of being here, actually across the parking lot at Town Hall when Adam was sworn in, and it was wonderful to see so many members of the Irondequoit community here to welcome Adam and his team. And I've been watching the work that they've been doing. They're doing great work. Adam and I just this past week were at a wonderful event, the Parent Leadership Training Institute, an organization here in the community that's working with parents to make sure that they can be leaders, they can be advocates for their children. That's the kind of work that Adam and his team are doing, and I couldn't agree with him more. Now more than ever, the opportunity to work together in local government in partnership to share resources, cut costs is just more important than ever. But obviously this program this morning about the state budget is very important, not just for people in Irondequoit, for people in Brighton, but statewide. And it's a lot of material you're looking at, you're going to be digesting this morning. But I think just the fact that this forum is taking place and other forums like this are an indication of the commitment that Assembly Majority Leader Joe Morelli and the whole team really has committed. We're not all going to agree on every word in that budget. That's the nature of a democracy. But what you're going to see today is the opportunity to look at some of these new initiatives like pre-K, like the proposed tax freeze. And you have the opportunity with the Assembly Majority Leader here in the room to ask the questions that are important, to get answers, and again, to work in partnership in an open government. That's what a democracy is all about. In all the years that I've worked with Joe Morelli, that's what he's committed to. We are fortunate to have representing us in Brighton, in Irondequoit, and in the greater Rochester community, my good friend, Assembly Majority Leader Joe Morelli.
The one disadvantage about following Bill Maley is the size difference between he and I. So first of all, welcome. Thank you all for coming. I apologize we had to change venues, but the elevator, we understand from the supervisor, is not functioning, and we were concerned about folks who had mobility issues getting in here and wanted to make sure it was on the first floor. So thank you all for being here this morning. First of all, to Irina, and I saw Joseph. I know he's here somewhere because I saw him come in. Right there, and Dave Seeley, who are elected officials at the town and county level. Thanks for their hard work and for being here this morning, all that they do for our community. Adam, as folks know, in Irondequoit is our new town supervisor, just finished his second month on the job. It's been a little bit of a whirlwind, and I know he's gotten the learning curve has gone very quickly for him. He's doing an amazing job, and I'm blessed to have him here and have him as a friend, and thanks for the opportunity to host this. And Bill Maley, who I hate to say how long we've known each other, probably 30 years, I was thinking the other day. Bill, he's been an outstanding public servant, and now in his capacity as the Brighton Town Supervisor. So I'm grateful for both of them to be here and to be so generous in their comments. And I'm sure they have busy things and busy schedules today, so if they don't stay, I'm not going to be offended. No one else should be either. I know they've got a million things to attend to, but thank you for both of you for being here. So thanks for you. What my hope is to just highlight some of the things that have been proposed in the governor's budget, and largely what I'll be talking about is what we refer to, I guess this is the technical term, is the executive budget, which is the proposal that the governor sends to the legislature for consideration. So much of this will detail what the governor has proposed, some of which, or much of which, I think the legislature will agree to. There will be differences of opinion, and I might start by just mentioning sort of what the process is. So the governor submits in the latter part of January a budget to the legislature for its consideration. And then over a period of the next 6 to 8 weeks, the legislature will, first of all, try to understand what's in the budget. Governors are notorious for trying to hide things from us to make it easier for us and easier for them. But our job is to sort of distill that down and figure out what the implications of the proposal are. And then what will happen on March 1st, just happened, is the Senate and the Assembly and the governor's staff will get together, and we will try to come to an agreement on the amount of revenues that we think will be available based on the tax package the governor proposed to us. And oddly enough, because much of this is driven by economics, we don't have a property tax at the state level, so we don't know with certainty how much money will be generated by our income tax structure, our sales taxes. That's largely based on economic trends. We all have our different econometric models. We run them, we come to a decision, and recently we agreed on about $140 million more, I believe, than the governor suggests is available, which out of a $140 billion budget is pretty much a rounding error. So we're pretty much in agreement in terms of what revenues are available to us. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Just for further information, so this week, upcoming, the Assembly will pass a resolution, and in that resolution, it will identify the areas where we agree with the governor, but more importantly, will set out what areas we disagree with the governor on. Then there will be many. It will be a few pages long. It will identify the challenges that we think the governor's budget presents to the state, areas where we might disagree philosophically. And the Senate will do the same thing. We will do ours on Wednesday. I think the Senate is scheduled to do their version of it on Tuesday or Wednesday as well. And then we go through what is commonly referred to as conference committee process, where members of the Senate and the Assembly will sit down in public view and will discuss the differences between the Senate resolution, the Assembly resolution, and the governor's budget, and we will try to, by March 31st, come to a conclusion and an agreement. The governor will then send a final budget to us, which we will vote to approve, and then he will sign. So that's sort of the process. We are now right in the middle of it. We're about to pass a resolution this week in the Assembly and Senate, so this is, we thought, an appropriate time to sort of bring people together, talk about what is in the budget, where we've come sort of fiscally, some of the big items, and then obviously answer any questions or listen to comments that you might have. You'll pardon me a little bit. My technical skills are somewhat in question, and so what I'm going to do is try to use this as a sense of where we are in terms of highlighting some stuff. So let's see if we can get through it. First thing that I do want to do is talk about how far we've come relative to where we were. And this is a pretty dramatic turnaround in the state's fiscal fortunes over the last several years. When Governor Cuomo first took office, we were facing, in his first fiscal year, a $10 billion deficit, meaning that had the current, or had at the time, the expenditure pattern and revenue patterns not changed, we would have been imbalanced at the end of the fiscal year of his first budget by $10 billion. We are bound by law to have a balanced budget, so that couldn't happen, but it gives you a sense of how out of proportion our spending was to our revenue package. Over the last 3 years, we have delivered what we believe is better, more efficient government with results for the people of the state of New York. And you'll see that not only have we been able to address what at the time was a $10 billion deficit, each successive year that deficit has gone down to the point where we are now looking at in the next couple of years, a $2 billion surplus in state revenue. So we have reorganized the government. We have changed the way we deliver, for instance, Medicaid. For those of you are not particularly aware of how Medicaid works, we used to use something called a fee-based service system, which essentially was someone who was on Medicaid would receive a service, whether it was going to the doctor or a nurse practitioner or being in the hospital or nursing home, et cetera, and would be paid for that service. Medicaid would get a bill which would get paid. And instead, we have moved to what's called managed care, which was done in the private sector and a private insurance for many, many years, and now that is a system that we moved to. So we've redesigned much of what we've done. The governor has negotiated new labor contracts, which he feels are appropriate to the state's fiscal condition, while reducing debt and pension liability. And I will say, in talking about the fiscal situation the state finds itself in, comparing or contrasting 3 years ago to today, we have balanced the budgets without borrowing money. There's been no borrowing on the state's behalf to address it, and we've done it without raising taxes. So two things that the legislature was really committed to doing with the governor. So I talked about Medicaid. I talked about how we have changed this relative to all sectors. We have a Medicaid redesign team, which has really changed the way Medicaid is delivered in the state. And we have gotten away from, when I first got to Albany, annual increases in the Medicaid program could be 10, 15, 18% a year, maybe double digits. And obviously, if you're compounding that over time, it's an extraordinary growth in the cost of the Medicaid system. We are now projecting this year's growth in cost of Medicaid to be 3.8%, which is in large part due to the Medicaid redesign efforts. When it relates to economic development, one of the things that the governor has done, something that I actually recommended a number of years ago, was to create regional councils to recognize the fact that the economies in the various regions of the state are not the same. They don't have the same strengths. They don't have the same types of workforce. If you think about where we have been as a community, particularly relative to our manufacturing base, which has clearly declined, but Rochester's manufacturing, its economy is driven by optics. Bausch & Lomb, it was delivered by the kinds of things that Kodak did, xerography. So a lot of ours was around optics. It was imaging. That's a strength that we have, and we want to continue to utilize and leverage that strength. Even though our manufacturing jobs have declined, we still have extraordinary capabilities in those areas, as well as material sciences. It's different in Buffalo. It's different in the North Country. It's different in each of the regions of the state. So we've established regional economic development councils. We have one in the Finger Lakes, which I'm privileged to sit on, and in the last 3 years, those economic development councils have returned $340 million to our region on transformative jobs and transformative technologies. I've talked a little bit about our fiscal outlook. The three major rating agencies have moved New York from a stable to a positive rating. Employer confidence has led the state to now reach an all-time high for private sector jobs, which is an important consideration not only in budget, but obviously in the well-being of the state. And we're delivering a government that New Yorkers, we think, can be proud of. And I will say that I think this will be the fourth straight year, which doesn't seem like it's that extraordinary unless you know our past history, a fourth straight year of on-time budgets that will be balanced and will be in place before the start of the fiscal year. So just to give you a sense of where we were over the last 50 years, and this includes a number of budgets which I voted against for fear that this was happening and we would not be able to sustain it. So if you look at the income growth of people in the state of New York, which is the middle bar in this bar graph, income growth of the state of New York over a 50-year period, nearly 50-year period, was 6.2% annually. Spending in the state of New York was 6.8% annually, which meant the spending habits of the state and its government outpaced the income growth of the residents who lived in the state. And that, in our view, particularly when inflation was running at 4.1%. Now, some people would say, okay, income growth outpaced inflation. That's true, and that's not a bad sign. But when spending is over 2.5% beyond inflation on an annualized basis for 50 years, you get yourself into significant challenges, which is why we're in part facing a $10 billion deficit just 3 years ago. This is what it would look like if spending had actually maintained the same rate of growth as personal income over that period of time. our budget in 2010 would have been $45 billion instead of the actual budget of $84 billion. So we've taken on a new tact, and the governor deserves credit for this. Spending in the last 3 years, as it opposed to the 6.8% over the previous 50 years, spending annually has been less than 1% in the state of New York. State debt is down dramatically from 3.6% of the state's budget down to less than 1/10 in terms of growth. I'm sorry, that's growth in the state debt year to year over the previous 25 years in the last 3 years, which is another sign that we haven't balanced the budget by simply going out and borrowing or using credit cards to do it. And this is, as I said, the budgets. If you looked at it in fiscal year 11-12, and I say fiscal year because our fiscal year is April 1 to March 31st. We have the earliest fiscal year, start of a fiscal year of any state in the country, and we also have the earliest adoption date of any state in the country. But you can see over the last 3 years we've gone from a $10 to a $1.4 billion deficit. This year, we're looking forward. The budget presented to us, even before changes that the governor made to it, would have produced a $500 million surplus, and in the out years, 1.5 up to a little over $2 billion surplus is projected. We have balanced the budget. We've reduced spending. We've also made some, you'll see in this budget the governor has proposed, and I think it's fair to say the legislature will agree, certainly with the universal pre-K, the governor's proposed a $1.5 billion expenditure over the next 5 years to essentially have full-day pre-K for every student in the state of New York. And this is in alignment with what education professionals tell us is the very, very critical part of a child's educational and emotional and mental development is to have universal pre-K. So that's what we're attempting to do. You'll note, those of you who pay attention to this, that the new mayor of New York City, Mayor de Blasio, has been calling for an increase in New York City's income tax, not the state income tax, but New York City's income tax. New York City and Yonkers, I think, are the two jurisdictions in the state that have their own income tax on top of the federal and state. He has called for us to fund his portion of it through a New York City income tax. Other new investments are an after-school program. The governor's proposed $720 million over 5 years and a $2 billion bond act, which would be voter approved this November. If it is approved, it would result in $2 billion, largely dedicated to creating smart schools. So it's new technologies in schools, making certain that everybody has access to the kind of digital technology that is going to be necessary for young people in the 21st century. So this is sort of the general outline. Hold spending at below 2%. As I said, this will be the 4th consecutive year that we've done that. Reduces taxes by more than $2 billion. And this is part of how the governor proposes using the projected surpluses is by lowering the tax burden on certain New Yorkers, and we'll talk about that. Increases education aid by $800 million. That's about a 4% increase, although not all of it goes to the formula that we traditionally use. There's dollars for teacher excellence programs and some other programs. I'll talk about that in just a minute. I mentioned the $1.5 billion over 5 years to fund universal full-day pre-kindergarten. It also authorizes, as I mentioned, $720 million over 5 years for expanded after-school programs. This is particularly important in areas where there's a high degree of poverty. We're trying to keep kids in school where they're safe, where they're involved in enrichment programs, whether it's purely educational. It's probably not entirely extra classroom time, but it's opportunities for them to get mentoring help with homework, enrichment programs like music and art, etc. $2 billion Smart Schools Bond Act, and then provides $1.2 billion in capital funding for our healthcare system, hospitals, nursing homes, long-term care facilities. These are all included in the governor's proposal. So again, just to give you an idea, the percent change in what we call all fund spending, and you'll hear different terms, but there's essentially, if you think about the way we think about this, there's certain revenues and dollars that are both raised at the state level and spent by the state, obviously, and then there are certain additional dollars which we get for programs which the federal government supplies us the dollars with. So the all funds budget is nearly, there's actually some additional money. It probably is about $142 billion all told. It includes $5 billion for some federal help for folks that were victims of Superstorm Sandy. But essentially the budget is $137 billion. Of that, 92 is state spending. So the federal government will contribute roughly $45 billion. Much of that is in Medicaid. So for every dollar that the state of New York spends in Medicaid, 50 cents of that dollar is reimbursed to us by the federal government. The federal government reimburses every state for Medicaid just at different percentage rates. Ours is actually the lowest in the country at 50%. Other states get as much as 70%, and that owes back to when the program was created in the 60s. New York was a wealthier state relative to the other states. We have a lower reimbursement rate. We've been petitioning the federal government for additional dollars and additional support for Medicaid. And that's happened in small degree, and we just agreed with the federal government on an $8 billion Medicaid waiver to help us do some innovative programs in Medicaid to reduce costs and improve patient experience and patient outcomes. But this is just a rough idea. Our all funds, state, including federal money, the budget will go up 1.3%. The state portion will go up 1.7%. And this is just a brief summary of just to sort of identify where the money goes, what the major programs are that we spend money on. Medicaid is the largest program that we spend money on, although this, when it comes to the state share, and I think this is just the state share, the $16.5 billion would be matched by another, actually probably more than that. Medicaid at the state level, we pay about, I think about 35% or less than 40% of the bill, because we get some from local governments as well. Counties pay for some of the Medicaid bill. But when it comes to state spending, Medicaid $16.5 billion. Schools, which is where we spend the most of our discretionary money, $22 billion roughly in fiscal year 14-15. State agencies are about $9 billion, and that's the Department of Corrections, Department of People with Developmental Disabilities, Department of Mental Health, Department of Health, et cetera, et cetera. $9 billion. All other things we spend money on is less than all the other Medicaid and education and school agencies put together. So that's what you see the total is. Those are the big pots. And frankly, most of the conversation that we'll have over the next several weeks and discussions with the governor will be on these issues. School aid usually ends up being the most controversial because different regions of the state have different needs, and so when we create our formula, we try to recognize the various needs. Most of the money is driven towards areas of poverty. So, our big 5 cities, or big 5 school districts, which is New York, Yonkers, Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo, get more money as a percentage because they tend to be needier based on wealth factors. So, and this is just another visual representation of how we do it. You'll see health, $47.3 billion at the top, includes Medicaid, and this is, I believe, all funds. So this includes the federal money as well as local government funds towards Medicaid. New York State operations, our running of our government, the actual state government, is less than $20 billion. Education, and that includes, I believe, that's aid to schools, but there's other educational programs that we have. The total is $27 billion. Higher educational system down at the bottom is about $3 billion. The STAR program, which every homeowner gets, actually the state pays the local government, so that actually is a state expenditure of $3.5 billion. Social services is $7.3 billion. That does not include Medicaid. And there's some other, obviously we have to pay debt on our bonding, capital and debt, and so some of that is debt payments, some of it is actual cash capital, the amount of money we use that's just cash to pay for roads and bridges. We don't borrow all the money for that. We spend some of it in cash capital. And then this is where it comes from. As I said, federal grants are nearly $46 billion. The vast bulk of that is Medicaid. Personal income tax in the state of New York is $44 billion. If you look down, business taxes are a little under $8 billion. Other taxes, fees, we have obviously user fees and taxes, $15.4 billion, and I think that includes sales taxes. So, cutting and reforming taxes, net combination of the management by the executive department will allow us to maintain our 2% spending limit. We believe that continues to improve the state's fiscal position. And my sense is, although there will be some changes, I said, in the Senate and Assembly's version of the budget, that we will largely agree with the governor to maintain spending at 2% for the year. We will also provide additional relief. Most of the relief that's contained in the budget will be property tax relief. Governor has proposed a number of programs, including a circuit breaker, which helps people who have lower incomes pay for property taxes. It will have, the budget includes a proposal for a tax freeze. We have a tax cap in place, which this year would be, I think, 1.46% over last year. So the way the tax cap works at local government levels is the governor has proposed, and we adopted, a plan that says you either can increase the property tax levy by 2% or the rate of inflation, whichever is lower. So this year it's lower, so it's 1.46%. And the governor has proposed that any spending over zero, as long as your local government is less than 1.46%, that increase would not be paid by homeowners, but would be paid for by the state of New York. The 2-year property tax freeze I just mentioned. The circuit breaker provides relief for individuals earning less than $200,000 along a sliding scale. The state would pay $1.7 billion for that because we have to reimburse the local governments for the difference between those two numbers. There is a renter's tax credit because obviously renters don't pay property taxes. They pay it in their rent, so we want to extend relief to people who are renters. And there's a change in the estate tax. This is the tax that's paid by families when someone dies. Their estate pays a tax. The state of New York has a higher percentage than does the federal government or most states. We also have a higher threshold. There's an exemption of $1 million. We would raise it to the federal exemption of $5 million, I think is the number. So property tax freeze, circuit breaker, renter's tax credit, estate tax relief is $5.7 billion for homeowners, renters, and families. And then there's additional relief that the governor has proposed on the corporate side as an inducement to businesses staying in New York or moving to New York. The first is we have a corporate franchise tax. That's the tax that businesses pay on their profits. It's currently at 7.1%. The governor's proposed reducing that to 6.5%. There's a manufacturer's tax credit, which would give them, a manufacturer in the state of New York, a 20% credit against their property tax burden. And you see what the dollar amounts are: $900 million for the corporate income tax reduction, $400 million for the manufacturer's tax credit. That's important for those of us in upstate New York, in particular, continuing to try to expand our manufacturing base, despite some people's views that manufacturing is gone. We don't believe that. We think that there's opportunities here. And there's an additional manufacturer's tax cut proposed for upstate manufacturing, which would essentially take their income tax burden, their state tax burden, down to zero. And look, we have a pretty significant manufacturing base still. It's clearly not what it once was, but we have pretty vibrant tool and die a sector in New York, and we're working very hard at the redevelopment of Eastman Business Park and others to try to bring manufacturing back. We announced a $3 million investment in a fermentation cluster in Eastman Business Park. So we think there are opportunities, and we think this will help spur the development of those manufacturing jobs, particularly in upstate New York. And then there's the acceleration. The 18A is an energy tax that people and businesses pay, homeowners and businesses pay. It's expected to, it's scheduled to go out of existence. The governor's proposed the acceleration of that so that we get rid of it sooner rather than later. Those reforms, changes, cuts, tax cuts, however you seek to look at them, would essentially be $2 billion against our current revenues. The interesting thing is our view is more jobs in the state. If this does the intended effect of bringing more jobs to New York, will mean more people here paying personal income taxes, more people paying sales taxes, more people paying property taxes, the rise in property tax values and property values for homeowners. So that's the governor's proposal as it relates to corporate taxes. The governor proposes another round of dollars for the regional economic development councils, links them to Startup New York, which is a program we passed at the end of last year. Startup New York is our tax-free zones for new businesses in New York or businesses that would move to New York. They're involved in innovative technologies and are linked to research that's going on in our state university. So it's a way to directly link entrepreneurs and businesses, emerging businesses, with all the research that we have. We have an extraordinary post-secondary educational system in New York. Universities are magnificent, and they're doing amazing amounts of research. You only have to look at the University of Rochester and RIT to see some of the great work that they're doing. This allows us to connect emerging businesses with the technologies at those universities. And I will say, last week the governor named the members of the board of Startup New York that deals with private universities. There's a board for that. There's not a board for the SUNY system. They already have a board in place. And the interesting reason he did it is I asked him when he was in town 2 weeks ago, there's actually a company that wants to move and create 100 jobs immediately, move from Connecticut here. They've been doing work with RIT, very closely with RIT. It involves recovery of data. That's as far as I know. But they'd create 100 new jobs. So we create this board. We bring them in. They won't pay income tax, corporate taxes. They won't pay corporate property taxes. But they have 100 people who will be here now employed, or people that they'll bring with them. My guess is they'll employ mostly people in New York. But it promises real opportunities for us. It's a 10-year tax relief. So in the 11th year, they would then obviously be, and I think it's a sliding scale in the out years, and then they'd be back to essentially paying the standard tax rates after the 10-year period. Talked about the tax reforms, tax relief. We're trying to build a new economy for New York. The launch of Global New York, which links Startup New York with global opportunities. It's obviously a global economy, and looking for opportunities to make sure our products and services in New York are linked around the world. And so the governor wants to expand that and create, instead of just Startup New York, Global New York. That's part of our proposal that the governor sent to us. And as I said, more dollars for these regional economic development councils. Rochester won the competition 2 years ago. We received nearly $100 million, which was the biggest award at the time. Last year, we received about $70 million in support from the Economic Development Council work. Open for Business is a $50 million initiative that the New York State Power Authority provides. They actually sell power in the marketplace, and $50 million of that will be used for our economic development initiatives, as well as a proposal which has $500 million for upstate capital projects, and that will be done in conjunction with our economic development councils and based on their priorities. So, as it relates to schools, the governor continues our commitment to improve student outcomes, sustainable cost growth, and not making commitments that we can't meet. There have been times when we've had to do mid-year school cuts. It's the worst thing for schools. We've had a lot of late budgets. That's bad for schools because it doesn't allow for predictability. So we're doing it on time, and we're trying to do an equitable distribution. And my friend Bill Ansbro, I don't want to point him out, but he's the gentleman sitting here by himself. He's the CFO of the city school district, so he's watching me very carefully here as we try to meet the needs of poorer school districts, but also all school districts, and make sure that every child in this state has the resources necessary to allow them to be successful in their career and in post-secondary education. So this is sort of just a rundown of what it is. The governor's proposed $800 million in additional money over the 14-15 fiscal year, $600 million of which will go to school districts in formula-based aid, which is reflected in sort of two big pots, foundation and gap elimination adjustment. That was a gap elimination adjustment is a term is an odd term, but a number of years ago we changed the formula to try to drive more money to school districts in need. And we found we couldn't fully fund that formula at the time. We didn't have the resources. So we took from the wealthiest school districts, they took a haircut, and that's called gap elimination adjustment. And we're trying to put some of that money back for them, and we're also trying to make sure that schools that have significant fiscal challenges are getting more money as well. And as I mentioned, the governor has a proposal for a $2 billion bond act. My guess is this will be changed somewhat by the time the legislature is done with it. Some of the definitions we'll probably want fleshed out a little better, but it is a commitment to broadband in every school in areas that are not well served, and to make sure that every child has access to iPads and computers. It's amazing. I was in a classroom in East Irondequoit just a couple of weeks ago. It's amazing what these young people are doing. Things I wouldn't even imagine. School lessons are completely different. A lot of it owes to just the ability to have technology. You know, it's amazing too. I mean, this clearly wouldn't have happened when I was in college or high school or the first 25 years of my career, but whenever there's a question now that somebody has a question about, you immediately take out your smartphone, you Google it, and you have an answer. So now these fights that we have about who is the greatest center fielder in baseball history can kind of be decided because you can check statistics at the drop of a hat. And I've lost my glasses, which is a really bad sign. I'm sure they'll show up. I'll do this by memory. So I mentioned earlier universal pre-kindergarten. It's a little bit of an issue that people have raised because, well, they went far. Thank you. Because we still have, in some places in the state, we don't have universal kindergarten. So there's some conversation about, how do we justify that? How do we make that a reality? Because it seems incongruous to have 3- and 4-year-olds going to school all day, and then when you get to be 5 years old and go to kindergarten, it's only half day. So we're going to have to obviously address that. But there is a big push by educators and policymakers to make sure that children are in school earlier. It's a very, very difficult global economy and a global environment, and our kids have to be well prepared for this. After school programs I mentioned earlier, Teacher Excellence Fund has come under some criticism, but this is it is a plan to try to put dollars to help reward teachers. I think the rewarding teachers is the part that's gotten a lot of legislators feeling as though that's probably not the right way to use this money. But you may see additional dollars for teacher centers, which we have in the state, to try to continue continuing education and continuing professional development for teachers who are now having to deal with new kinds of curriculum under the core curriculum that's being discussed and hotly debated. So general education support, the 2-year increase that's projected, we started a few years ago about doing a 2-year budget on schools, largely because there was so much fighting about school aid every year. We thought, well, let's fight every other year instead of every year. So it would reflect about a $1.3 billion increase over 2 years. Performance programs, these are something called PTAC, it's teacher bonuses, $75 million. The pre-K and after-school programs would be $460 million. It's the $1.5 billion is over 5. We spend $460 in after-school and pre-K. It's actually 1.5 and then 700. It's 2.2 billion all told over 5 years. 460 million in the first 2 years of the 5-year plan. And you can see the $2 billion Smart Schools initiative. So all told, would be educational funding would be $27 billion just this year. And 2-year total would be somewhere north of $55 billion. Higher education obviously is critically important to us. I mentioned how important our post-secondary education is, both as just a tool for workforce development, but also all the research that's going on. It's academically important. It's important in terms of economic development and being able to connect graduates to jobs. And there are a lot of jobs that are going wanting, and we're trying to do a better job of not only workforce training, but connecting people. So higher education is another round of funding for something called SUNY 2020 and CUNY 2020, the New York City version of SUNY. We're offering a program the governor's proposed, which I think is very interesting, which is students who finish in the top 1%, or top 10% rather, of high school graduating classes will have an opportunity, if they choose to go into STEM courses, which is the big push to have science, technology, engineering, math courses. If they choose to do that and go to a SUNY school, we'll pay for their tuition. And they have to pursue a STEM career. So it's not just take a couple courses. This has to be your thing. We've actually had the private colleges call us, because this only relates to SUNY and CUNY right now, but a lot of the private universities are interested in this as well as they try to promote STEM programs. And these are there's a big shortage and there's a big need. So this is one of the ways that we're attempting to do it, and to get people who come from diverse backgrounds who may not be interested to start looking at STEM careers where they might not have otherwise. And then there's something called the New York Youth Works program, and we're trying to connect that to community colleges. This is an opportunity for inner city youth to learn job schools and to be connected to community colleges to hopefully enhance the opportunities for them and the percentages of them that will go to school. We obviously continue the Medicaid reforms that I talked about earlier. We are trying to find effective models that have really 3 goals in mind. 1, to reduce costs, so to be more cost effective. Secondly, to improve patient outcomes so that they're healthier. and third, to improve the experience that they have so that the frustrations of dealing with the healthcare system we're trying to address. It's a fragmented system. You might go to a primary care provider, you might be in a hospital, you might see specialists, none of whom might talk to one another. So it's trying to make this all a more consistent experience for patients, not only for Medicaid, but just generally. But obviously the state's contribution to this in terms of Medicaid is to pay for people who are indigent and can't afford it. I might say also, just as parenthetically, Medicaid is now 70% of Medicaid dollars are paid for caring for the elderly in one form or another, whether it's in-home services or nursing home services, and whether that's skilled nursing or assisted living. And that number will probably continue to grow as people my age, the baby boomers, they call it a tsunami. I've never really felt like I was part of a tsunami, but I guess that's what they're calling this now. So it's a big deal, which is why now we have to redesign this system, because in a number of years it's going to get much, much more costly if we don't make these reforms to it. We did increase the Medicaid funding consistent with the spending cap. As I said, it's 3.8%. That's a significant change from a number of years ago, but allows us to continue to be under 2% in terms of our global spending increase, which we're doing. And as I said, we're trying to transform the system. One of the things we're doing here in Rochester, which I was a part of, I chaired something called the Rochester Health Innovation Collaborative. We received $26 million from the federal government's Affordable Care Act. We're redefining and redesigning primary care in New York, particularly for the elderly and for people who have chronic conditions, to try to reduce expenditures for them and to try to give them, as I said, better experience and better outcomes. We'll continue to implement these things. I talked about managed care for Medicaid recipients. That's one of the things that we have continued to push. There are, no matter when you do something that's big like this, there's always challenges and there's always things you didn't expect that are coming up. So we're continuing to make adjustments and changes to it, but we're going to continue to do that. And we're supporting the New York Benefit Exchange. This is part of the Affordable Care Act. Interestingly enough, New York has one of the best exchanges in the country. We've worked very, very hard to make this work. We've enrolled more than 500,000 people who didn't have insurance coverage, who now are paying for or have some form of insurance. And that means fewer people will hopefully be showing up in hospitals and emergency rooms without insurance that we all pay for and is reflected in your insurance policies. So whether you think we pay for it or not, we do. But hopefully by getting these people insurance, we will avoid that sort of invisible charge and make our hospitals and healthcare systems more intelligent, because if you have insurance, you tend to go to a primary care doctor, you tend to get more wellness checkups, you tend to stay healthier, or you tend to, if you get injured, or more importantly, if you get sick, you tend to go to the doctor sooner if you have insurance, instead of waiting until it becomes a very acute condition, and then you end up in the emergency room and you have you're hospitalized for whatever condition. The Health Improvement Collaboratives, this is something that we've been working on in Rochester for a number of years. We're actually one of the we are the state leader in this regard, one of the national leaders in this. We have something called the Finger Lakes Health Systems Agency. They have a number of different initiatives that they work on, but essentially trying to make sure that the capacity of our healthcare system is consistent with what our needs and our population is. A few years ago, we had something called the Burger Commission in the state, which closed hospitals and all across the state, except in our region, largely because of the work of this as a healthcare planning organization. And the governor, because of our work, has awarded $2 million in his budget proposed for their continued work. And because it's such a great model, he's created a pot for $7 million for other agencies like this to be created around the state. So we really are leaders in this regard. And the effort that I was involved in earlier, the Health Innovation Collaborative, was a committee of the Finger Lakes Health Systems Agency. So the governor's proposed $2 million for them, $7 million for other areas to copy essentially what we do, and even put $500,000 in there for, in addition to the $2 million for the Finger Lakes Health Systems Agency, so that they can train other communities on how to do what we're doing. Provides funding for supportive services for needy populations. This is continuing to be a challenge for us, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's efforts for veterans returning from military service and their families. It's also for child care subsidies for low-income individuals, and you're going to see that this is going to be a big conversation during the next several weeks. And obviously, we continue to have support for people with developmental disabilities. We're struggling to find housing for them so they can be independent, and we're continuing to work at that, and we actually ran into a big problem with the federal government last year because they said we spent too much, particularly in Medicaid, on people with developmental disabilities. So we've reached a settlement with them, which is not without some sacrifice, but we're continuing to work through that. And hopefully I'm almost done so you can ask questions. We're expanding affordable housing opportunities. This is a big deal. Rochester and Monroe County has a fabulous group of developers that work on affordable housing. We have probably more proposals than any other region in the state, and it's hard to pick through them, but there are finite dollars. But we've added $100 million to create and preserve 3,000 housing units in multifamily developments. We created a Commission on Youth, Public Safety, and Justice. Only one of 2 states that actually still charges 16 and 17-year-olds with puts them through the adult criminal justice system. So we would join all the other states in the union that do it differently. That's part of a series of recommendations the governor did, and he's establishing a Commission on Youth, Public Safety, and Justice to make those recommendations on dealing with juveniles in a more thoughtful way than we are right now, and improve outcomes and also reduce recidivism so they just don't end back in the criminal justice system. One of the other things, I just skipped over it, pay for success. This is something called social impact bonds, which is a fascinating sort of new thing that's being developed in our financial system, which is people have said for years, if you invest in social programs, you'll reduce the amount of costs at the end of a person's life. So lifetime costs for someone who's in the public welfare system or incarcerated in prisons. And if you would provide programs, we could reduce the cost. Well, we've taken up a lot of the people who have said that or made that claim by now floating social impact bonds. So investment houses like Goldman Sachs and others are underwriting bonds, which people buy as a return on investment, to provide these programs and then to measure whether or not they actually return the savings that they've always promised that they would return. And if there is, there's a return on investment for the investors. So it's trying to use entrepreneurship and investing to provide dollars for social programs. So we'll see how this goes. We're starting to do it. Other places around the country are experimenting with social impact bonds as well. And we did do some of this last year, and we're continuing it with an additional $30 million to last year's social impact bonds. Increased child care funding. There's a block grant which would increase funding. This is a big initiative. Maggie Brooks in the county has been campaigning in Albany and advocating for additional expenditures in child care. In addition to that, we're trying to increase opportunities for veterans primarily through purchasing contracts. So veterans that own companies would get as we currently do for minority and women-owned businesses, there would also be a set-aside in contracts for businesses owned by veterans who are having a difficult time returning from military to civilian life. Government efficiency, just briefly, we're working with local governments, trying to address their concerns. Many of them are under distress. There's actually a financial restructuring board that works with some of our cities, and they do have difficult times. Some of it is things that we've imposed at the state or that the public thinks ought to be imposed. So we're working through what are the costs that are going to local governments, how do we relieve them. We've changed the pension system a little bit to reflect those costs, and we're continuing to work through this, and we're doing it as we also try very hard to hold the lid on property tax increases. So, school district and local government cap, I mentioned that earlier. In the second year of this freeze plan, local governments have to come up with a proposal on how to reduce costs by consolidation. This is actually a pretty controversial proposal in the legislature. I think it will be changed before we're done with it because there's some concerns on what kind of impact this has or what kind of mandates it imposes on local districts and local governments. Just a quick review. There are 624 what the governor calls local governments. I think that's a little bit of a stretch to call them governments, but we have districts. We have 62 sewer districts in Monroe County. We have 14 refuse districts. We have 161 lighting districts. We have sidewalk districts. We obviously have school districts, fire districts, villages, towns, 624 local governments that produce a total tax levy of $1.6 billion. And that's one of the reasons the governors continue to push for opportunities of consolidation to try to, and you see that, special districts, 551. Those are the water, sewer, refuse, lighting, et cetera. And if the governor were to have his way, he believes by, sort of extrapolation that we could save $16 million. That would be 1% of the $1.6 billion, and then over a 3-year total of $46 million through consolidations. This still has to be worked out. There's a lot of detail. I think there's some skeptics in the legislature about whether this can be done the way he says it can be done. But clearly we're starting to address in a real way consolidation and shared services, at least at the local government level. I mentioned this. I won't repeat it. It's in the materials that we're handing out about local government consolidation. We're trying to eliminate mandates at the local level, although not as fast as local governments say. It's interesting, at the county level, the biggest mandate they have is Medicaid, and we have dramatically reduced the impact of Medicaid on county governments. We've frozen them. They don't have any increase in their Medicaid allocation. It continues to be a declining portion of their budget. We've taken all the administrative costs and are paying for that at the state level as well. So you don't hear county executives, you still hear them complaining, but you'll hear them complaining less because they have less and less of a burden to pay for Medicaid, and the state is assuming more and more of their responsibility for Medicaid payments. Medicaid relief, I just mentioned. Pension reform, I mentioned we had done earlier. We have a new pension tier, Pension 6, Tier 6, which will take, it's slow in having an impact because in order for you to hire people, people have to retire. So as people retire and new people come online in local and state government, they'll go into a less generous pension system called Tier 6. This deals with Affordable Care Act funding acceleration. We'll be able to continue to lower Medicaid contributions to the counties through something called FMAP, which is an enhanced contribution from the federal government to us for Medicaid. I mentioned we are at 50%. This allows us additional money, which will reduce the burden on local governments and counties. And we've done some reforms to early intervention programs, which were enacted 2 years ago in the 2012 budget, which saves local governments $54 million. So we're continuing to look at ways of reducing the burden on county governments as well. So this is the reforms. It doesn't get talked about. We hear a lot of local governments sort of continuing to argue for changes, but we've reduced their burden by over nearly $5 billion, $4.5 billion. That will be the savings in just the first 5 years of these different items: the Affordable Care Act, FMAP, local Medicaid takeover, Tier 6 pension, and the early intervention reforms. We increased funding for the Environmental Protection Fund, which we use for a whole host of important environmental initiatives. We increased it by 157, not an increase, it's an increase of $4 million over last year. It's $157 million on these programs. Brownfield cleanup, this is very important to urban cores for cities that are trying to redevelop properties rather than to build in the outer suburbs to continue to reuse properties, and those that are contaminated will make use of the brownfield program and redevelopment. Infrastructure investments, we're expanding opportunities. The governor loves this hunting, fishing, and other activities. He calls it, I forgot, is it the adventure license, I think is what he calls it, something like that. The governor's very big on kayaking and fishing, and he challenges the legislature. There's a challenge tomorrow. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there to go to Lake Placid. There's a snowmobile challenge. I think I am going to do bass fishing against the governor later this year, which will be good for the bass, at least the ones that I'm trying to catch. So he's very big. He did last year a yogurt summit. We're beer and wine trails. We're big on expanding tourism opportunities in upstate New York and taking use of all the things that we know are great about upstate New York, but may be a secret to other people around the state or certainly other people around the country. And let me just talk very briefly about public safety. We're continuing to promote, we talked about the initiative around young people. Interoperability communications, we're investing another $75 million to allow agencies to be able to communicate, and interoperation is a big problem, particularly during times of crisis, which we've had more than our share of in terms of natural disasters. There's another program that invests $15 million into a new initiative that's gun-involved violence elimination, focused on reducing violence in our communities. And this is similar to, or going to give to communities that are involved with Operation Impact, which has been a big success and which our law enforcement community is very, very involved in and very supportive of. And then this is the State Protection Cloud, $10 million in shared technology to eliminate barriers to effective information sharing. This is all part of the initiative. The governor's, he always says what keeps him awake at night our natural disasters, and we've had more than our share. Whether it's climate change or whatever it is, we're troubled by it, and we're taking all steps that we can to mitigate it. Prison capacity, we're trying to right-size that. There are new initiatives against drunk driving, much harsher penalties, as well as penalties for distracted driving, which is now taking more young people than even drunk driving is, or driving while under the influence of drugs. It's a big problem, and frankly, we're all probably, I know I am occasionally guilty of it, getting less and less guilty. I sit in the back seat now more, which isn't really good for driving, but it helps me. Capital investments in our transportation system. This is a big deal. Bridge and roads, we have to invest more. We're working on it. I have a number of proposals which I'm trying to get my colleagues to take up to improve that, improving customer safety at Department of Motor Vehicles. Infrastructure continues to be something that we're working on. We're trying public-private partnerships to invest more money. The Tappan Zee Bridge, which people said could never get replaced, is as a result of a public-private partnership. We're using design-build. We're increasing transit aid levels. And we now have both chairs of the Transportation Committee in both houses are in Rochester. David Gannon, Assembly, and Joe Robach was appointed to chair the Transportation Committee in the Senate just last week. So I said I'd be an hour, and boy, that's pretty good, actually, an hour. So we're trying to be efficient. We're trying to be more effective. We're trying to keep costs under control. We're trying to create more incentives for businesses to locate here. We're trying to invest more in education so our children are better educated. We're trying to make sure that we have programs to take care of our neediest citizens. It's a big task. $140 billion, or 137 without the federal Sandy money, is a lot of money to spend, but there are 19 million New Yorkers, all with 19 million opinions. Actually, it's probably more than 19 million opinions out of the 19 million New Yorkers on how to spend it. This is the exercise we go through, and I appreciate you listening to me. And if there are questions or comments, I'd be delighted to hear from you.